Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. I'm Scott McCammon, President and CEO of the Milton Chamber of Commerce. As we all know too well, communities around the world have been learning how to cope during this pandemic, and it's something like we've never seen before. And with COVID being an invisible disease, it's left many people in sort of this perpetual state of anxiety. And over the past 6 months, we've all been self-isolating, wearing masks, sanitizing our hands, all in an effort to flatten the curve and to eliminate COVID. And this morning, we're joined with our good friends at Bell to talk about flattening the other curve, dealing with the looming mental health crisis. It was a decade ago that Bell realized that most people were not talking about mental illness. And so Bell started a new conversation with Bell Let's Talk, which is an initiative that has really helped to reduce the stigma around mental health. And now during the COVID pandemic, Bell understands the mental crisis is facing many, many more Canadians, and the need to have meaningful and helpful discussions with experts, including our guest speaker this morning, Dr. Ian Dawe. So now it's my pleasure to call on Lena DeMarco from the Community Affairs Department of Bell to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Dawe. Lena?
Thank you, Scott, and good morning, everyone. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Ian Dawe in taking time out of his busy schedule in these uncertain times. Today, in what is becoming a familiar format in the new world we live in, we are going to be treated to what promises to be an uplifting presentation. On behalf of all my colleagues at Bell, we are very proud to be supporting Dr. Ian Dawe and the Milton Chamber of Commerce. Bell's own operating principles in response to COVID-19 has been to keep Canadians connected and informed, prioritize the health and safety of the public, our customers and our team members, and support our communities. If also you would like more information on Dr. Ian Dawe's bio and presentation, it will be on the Milton Chamber site. I now have the pleasure in introducing our special guest speaker, Dr. Ian Dawe. Dr. Ian Dawe is an associate professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto. He is the program chief and medical director of mental health at Trillium Partners in Mississauga. He is also part of the Bell Let's Talk team of subject matter experts, providing information on how to recognize and help people within organizations struggling with mental health issues. It's also worth noting that Bell Let's Talk provided funding of $5 million for 5 organizations delivering mental health support to youth, family, and communities during the COVID-19 crisis. I will now pass it over to Dr. Ian Dawe. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Lena, and thank you, Scott, for the opportunity to talk today. It's a pleasure to be with everybody in the Milton Chamber. Hearing that introduction, I will do my best to make it an uplifting one. There's absolutely lots of reasons in the environment today to be stressed, to be distressed, to be really struggling with all of the things that are going on. And we want to provide some tips, to provide some acknowledgement of what's happening, and to help shepherd through this together. I will move to a shared screen now, and we will get started. I've titled this the Flattening the Other Curve perspective, because we all know, and as Scott had referenced, we are deep into this pandemic now, on the start of our 7th month. Flattening the curve has come to infection prevention and control terminologies, and we are well familiar with them at that point in time. But I wanted to step back from that, not to diminish it in every way. We still want to encourage test, trace, isolate, physical distance, hand washing, hygiene, masks, all of those things. But we also want to acknowledge that there is an underlying second curve to this, and that's the mental health impact. And that's what we want to spend our time today. As Lena has mentioned, I've had the privilege of being connected with the Let's Talk campaign for most of the last 10 years. And during that time, I've been really privileged to talk with groups across Ontario on topics ranging from interprofessional recovery-oriented care, mindfulness, suicide prevention, and workplace mental health. And I am profoundly grateful for the opportunities that they've given me in terms of coming before you and other similar groups across the province over the last few years. I hope it has been helpful. In the next 45 minutes or so, we will look at the evidence on the impact of this social isolation of people and thus their related mental health concerns. We'll talk about the interventions that show success in countering isolation and the other impacts of our COVID-19 response. And of course, it's not just COVID-19 these days. More on that in a few minutes. And we'll talk, I think, specifically about the enablers to engagement around mental wellness for yourselves, for your colleagues, for your families, and for others. A reminder, though, this thing isn't over yet. A current state snapshot of COVID-19 as of yesterday morning looks like this. We are well over 25 million cases in the world. Just yesterday, that's 213,000, almost 214,000 new cases. In Canada, that's 127,940 cases, an increase of 267 from the day before. And in Ontario, our totals are 42,309 case counts, which is a change, an increase of 114 from just the day before. Diving a little bit deeper into that Ontario database, you can see how the circumstances and the situations of the disease and where it has struck people have really taken the significant toll. And in the bottom half of this sector, I did want to draw your attention to the cumulative death count. As of yesterday morning, that's 2,811 confirmed deaths related to COVID-19. But just over 1,800 of them, much more than half, are in the long-term care home residents. An additional 205 in the retirement home residents. This pandemic has struck at some of our society's most vulnerable and most revered, and that is clearly a tragedy. Moving even further into the data point, this is just the case counts and the change from yesterday. And I do want to draw a couple of points here. Yes, long-term care homes, retirement homes, group homes are leading the pack on where the case counts are coming from. But third from the bottom, workplace. This is your environment. And this is what we want to draw attention to and keep people aware of the risks that are involved in congregating people together. Masks, physical distancing, hand washing, those are our key defense mechanisms. Appropriate social distancing. We are coming back into our workplaces. We are about to go back into the school systems. We need to keep these mantras in mind to keep all of us safe. Backing up a little bit with regards to the pandemic itself, I'm a particular fan, and I've showed this in a number of different contexts recently. This infographic was designed by a physician scientist in the United States called Victor Singh, and it really tried to lay out conceptually the various waves of the COVID-19 pandemic. And wave one and its tail is the purple line here. And it really spoke to the things we are most familiar with, the immediate mortality and the morbidity of the disease itself, and the recovery related to that when people were in the intensive care units and coming out. Wave 2 spoke about the impact of resource restrictions on urgent but non-COVID related conditions. This was because hospitals like ourselves across the country really were pivoting to managing the pandemic headlong. And that allowed our attention towards non-COVID related conditions to be mindfully put aside as we faced our worst case scenarios moving forward. It's not that we didn't pay attention to those things, but of course, our focus was specifically on the COVID conditions. Similarly, wave 3 was the impact of interrupted care on chronic conditions. This was because so much of the resources, again, were pivoting to urgent COVID and non-COVID related conditions. At Trillium, like most of our hospital partners across the country, if not in fact all of them, a lot of our ambulatory work was shuttered, closed, moved to virtual care. That's a great innovation, and we will keep all of the benefits of that part of care delivery change moving forward. But it really did, I think, in the short term, create conditions in which people who were struggling with non-COVID chronic conditions had their disease process worsen, and we need to manage that now. However, today it's about talking about that fourth wave, and this is where we see psychic trauma, mental ill health, post-traumatic stress disorder, the effects of economic injury, burnout, and more. Community disasters and pandemics, historically, just like this one, tend to aggravate the stresses and the vulnerabilities that are already in a society. Things like family violence, social isolation, the job losses and poverty, most of which have really robust links to increased mental ill health. And the lessons that we have learned internationally from COVID-19 and from earlier disasters and epidemics too, suggest that the mental health impacts are long-term, complex, and may take much time to fully emerge. In fact, you can see based on this infographic out of the Hertfordshire Trust in the UK, that the mental health impacts occur right across the lifespan. Issues like the boredom and isolation from friends and peers that were experienced over the last 6 months by our children. The very real financial worry and the job losses caused by the economic contraction. The fears of getting sick that we all faced, the loss of loved ones to the pandemic. Also, moral injury and trauma experienced by our frontline healthcare workers that were experiencing death and sickness on a scale that none of us were used to. Taken together, all of these things can trigger mental distress, suicide, drug use, and compound pre-existing mental illnesses. And again, the impacts of mental health may show up only months after a disaster has passed. And I think we can all agree this is truly an unprecedented stress in our lifetime. It will test us as a society in terms of how we respond to it. Perhaps you in the chamber know more than others the toll of COVID-19 on the broader economy in 2020 is expected to be the largest and the most sudden economic contraction since the Great Depression. And methods to flatten the pandemic curve have paid off and are paying off continuously. Efforts are underway across the country to reopen gradually and safely. I think credit is due that the actions and investments of governments across Canada to date have helped us get this far. But the road to recovery, full recovery, remains long and uncertain. Today, and in the months to come, our economic health will still largely depend on our public health. Deloitte released this study, and I'm sorry the font is slightly blurry here in its translation, but this was a study that came out in August of this year, just last month at the beginning, and it was really tracking the mental health impact, the socioeconomic impact of the pandemic and our response to it across Canada's most vulnerable populations. It created quite a stir, and I just wanted to highlight a few things related to it. Gender inequality has been on the center stage of the inequality debate in this country for a long time. But it seems that, and Deloitte has done a good job at matching this out, it seems that unemployment caused by COVID-19 caused a disproportionate amount of job loss in the retail and in the service sectors. And consequently, heavy job losses and financial strain for women in particular. Those are the ones traditionally employed in those sectors. Even working women, by and large, carried the really significant stress of trying to balance working from home and being primarily responsible for their children's education at the same time over the last few months. I don't think we have acknowledged and appreciated just how tough that was for so many people. Deloitte also pointed out that age has been traditionally one of the most important factors to focus on in terms of income security, and that is quite true. People over the age of 65 have a low income rate higher than any other group in Canada, making them especially vulnerable as well to the pandemic's impacts on financial and food security as well, obviously, and unfortunately, for those of our elderly citizens living in long-term care and retirement home sectors, vulnerable to the deadly spread of the virus itself. And from our perch above the United States, Canadians have been watching in shock as the country they've long considered their closest friend and often their protector now seems to be acting like some crazed, erratic, and dangerous stranger. We realize that we have the power to affect change when it comes to diversity and inclusion, and recent events and uncertainty in the world have brought once again a welcomed opportunity to examine the impacts of systemic racism and inequality in our society. When it comes to diversity and inclusion, it's now a matter of looking specifically at where improvements can be made in our society. Leaders across the board are now recognizing and striving to eliminate that impact of systemic racism and promote diversity in their areas. But I think while it's important to recognize, it's not always clear where to start. There is a degree of uncertainty to this. Just as an aside, in the New York Times this weekend in the book review section, I cropped a picture and snapshotted it here on the right of this screen. And it was talking a lot about the publishing industry and all of the books that are coming out now. Specifically, it was actually looking at the type font and the colors chosen in the books themselves, in the covers. And you can see how much of the sans serif font, how much of the black, white, red, angry type of material is being promoted here in this coverage. It reflects how we're feeling, but it also echoes and promotes how we're feeling too. This truly feels like a dystopian time with everything that is going on, and we need to recognize how much of a toll that's taken on our sense of self. And if that wasn't enough, we are now thinking about going back to school. With COVID-19 curve flattening in many places, governments and school boards have started to develop and modify in real time their plans for an optional and a voluntary return to in-person teaching for students and families. And that's affected people in many, many ways. Students will have the chance to reconnect with friends and classmates and learn again in person. They'll be adjusting to the new normal in a classroom context, making it less anxiety-provoking for the future. Parents will have some of the challenge of that constant childcare lifted and allow a potential return to focus of work that has been taken away from them in the last 6 months. And for teachers, there is an opportunity as well to slowly return to their classrooms and identify new challenges in teaching during this unusual time. But despite all of those potential decisions, it is a wrenching and very anxiety-provoking decision for many that are involved. It's a positive sign that the classrooms are beginning to open up again, but it can still be difficult to cope with the uncertainty of changing our current situations and routines. And many teachers themselves are having their own struggles with the decision to return to classroom. Those concerns including potentially contracting the virus themselves and bringing it home to their families, being a carrier of the virus and passing it on to students or coworkers, or being unable to meet their own high standards of doing their jobs well as they've been trained to do them in these new changing circumstances. It's important to remember we can't completely eliminate risk in most situations in life, not just in COVID-19. We all know that at some level, life is uncertain. And right now, we do have to trust in our knowledge that the physical distancing, the wearing of masks, getting tested are reliably the best methods to keep everyone safe. Over the last 6 months, we've been all coping the best we can. And Statistics Canada recently came out with some interesting data on how people have been managing. This is the first infographic that I wanted to take you through. It was a survey where Stats Canada asked Canadians what it was like to be a parent during the COVID-19 pandemic in the height of the lockdown. And most people talked about screen time, reading, and physical activity being the most popular daily activities, with 89% percentage of participants saying their children were engaged in these selected activities at home. When asked about what it's like again to be a parent, what their concerns were, their responses were the following. Opportunities to socialize with friends remained one of parents' most significant concerns about their children. The amount of screen time that they were spending, 64% of parents worried about that. 54% worried about the loneliness or the isolation. And when considering the family unit itself, balancing childcare, schooling and work, 74% of families were concerned about that. It affected all ages within our families across Canada, not just preschool aged, not just young or middle school aged, but this was something we could all identify with. And in another Ontario study tried to look at some more problematic coping strategies that we ourselves as adults were engaged in. And this one came out in April, and it was specifically a snapshot of what we call maladaptive coping. That's coping that may allow us to feel better in the moment, but doesn't necessarily help to actually problem solve and to move forward adaptively. Maladaptive coping strategies were towards the bottom here, and there was a net increase in substance use and gambling responses of over 42%. That's alarming. Understandable in some respects, but not sustainable for the health of our society moving forward. So I invite you to take a temperature check. This is the first day of September. It is a pivot point from where we've been to where we are moving now into this fall. And it's important, I think, to ask yourselves how you're feeling these days. This graphic talks about 3 zones in which we have seen and supported people throughout this stage. Are you stuck in the fear zone, the one in which you may need some support and help moving forward? Are you in the learning zone? Hopefully by paying attention today and participating today, you're evaluating information and becoming more aware of the situations that will inform you of how to act moving forward. Are you in the growth zone, where you truly are focusing on the future, but living in the present, making yourselves grounded in the acceptance of what's going on, but increasingly secure in your ability to do the best you can moving forward? Ideally, we want to see people's responses to these questions moving from the continuum across left to right as they mature their responses. And indeed, we have heard a lot about mental health promotion and resiliency in these times. And in the context of exposure to significant adversity, resiliency is basically the capacity to adapt. Now, most of the resiliency theories that I've encountered in my work make a lot of good common sense, but they probably overlap in 3 ways. Resilient people, by and large, possess the following characteristics. They have a staunch, non-judgmental acceptance of reality as it is, an uncanny ability to improvise, to make the best of the situation that they're dealt with and the resources at their fingertips. And they have a deep belief that's often buttressed by strongly held principles and values that life is meaningful. You can bounce back from hardship with just 1 or 2 of those qualities, but you'll only be truly resilient with all 3 of them. It's an important point to recognize, though, in the context that we've spoken about, that it's not enough just to tell people or expect people to be resilient, particularly because the virus, our response to it, the social and economic costs of that response have threatened the very basis of the things that we've used to be resilient in the past. Our identity, our connections, our jobs, our routines, our food and financial security. So to cope now and to cope moving forward, we really do have to repair, replace, or rebuild those fundamental underpinnings of who we are. And I want you today to focus on 4 key areas that you can work on to build up your own resilience: hope, belonging, purpose, and meaning. Hope is something that drives optimism, both today and tomorrow. It's about reminding us that I can shape my future. Things won't be this way forever. It reminds us that we are not alone. And for those of you who might not necessarily be hopeful right now, find something to latch onto, something about your future that you can be hopeful about. New opportunities that will come as the lockdown restrictions ease. An unexpected connection in a relationship that you've developed with your still appropriately distanced neighbors, etc. Belonging. Belonging is about connectedness, the relationships that we share with family, with community, with nature. Again, it underlines that belief structure that we are not alone, that we are together in this. And as a frontline healthcare worker, I can tell you how valuable it's been to hear the honking of horns, the cheering, the encouragement, that the general public thinks that we've done a good job throughout this. That builds the sense of belonging and community that has sustained many of us throughout this pandemic. But social isolation and physical distancing can threaten that sense of belonging. So we really do want to encourage people to maintain it, to increase it as much as possible. That sense of connectedness with family, with community, with nature. Purpose. Your previous sense of purpose may have been shattered by this experience. The loss of jobs, the devastation of savings accounts, the new reality of food insecurity or evictions. But don't accept that as permanent. Once you've grieved the reality of those losses, focus on rebranding yourself and finding new purpose in the things that you are doing now. Commit fully to the opportunities that are presented to you, even if they're not the ones that you would have wanted under other circumstances. This is a temporary situation. It will eventually pass, and we will find our way through this together. And finally, it's about meaning. Maintaining or rebuilding a life that is worth living. Look, there may well be constraints on what our life looks like right now. That's okay. We can and we should accept that. But do not ever, ever let there be a constraint on whether you think life is worth living. It absolutely is, and everyone can support one another in that message. Well, let's talk about self-care as we move to the latter part of this presentation. How do we manage our stress and anxiety? The uncertainty about the changes that are unfolding around us make most people feel a bit anxious. That's normal, and that's okay. It's actually helpful to motivate us to take actions as we move forward. But it's when that anxiety becomes difficult to control, when the stress becomes overwhelming and it starts to significantly impact on our lives and our abilities to function, that's when we encourage people to come forward and seek support and help. Everyone does experience anxiety. It's part of the emotional and the protective responses that are hardwired into our body. The point isn't to eliminate worry, eliminate anxiety. The point is to manage it and accept the normal aspects of it so it becomes something that we can manage, not something that manages us. And in so doing, we encourage people to challenge their worries, challenge their anxious thoughts. High levels of anxiety and stress are usually fueled by the way that we think. For example, you might be having thoughts of, I'm going to get sick and I'm going to die, or there's nothing I can do, or I'm not going to be able to cope. But not all of those thoughts are actual facts. In fact, many of them are just thoughts, worries, beliefs that we hold. Just because we think something does not make it true, no matter how familiar it is to us. So encourage yourselves, encourage those around you to challenge negative thoughts that you hear and are aware of. Don't accept worry and distress as inevitable. Focus on adapting to those situations, using baby steps, using small, measurable success points, without losing sight of the values that make you who you are. When you have a success, celebrate it. Use it as a stepping stone to challenge yourselves to the next level, and then the one after that. Nothing builds confidence like success, but we must choose to actually go forward with that optimistic view, not pulled backwards by uncertainty. And perhaps one of the greatest wrestles that we're having right now with uncertainty is in the decision point of sending our child back to school. How do we manage our own uncertainty about what the environment is that we're sending our kids back to? How do we balance that stress? And what do we do to manage our children's anxiety, not just our own? Well, when we are faced with anxiety or uncertainty, we generally have two options. One, we work to increase our certainty about a situation. And two, we learn to tolerate the uncertainty. Now, many people who struggle with anxiety spend a disproportionate amount of time on that first option, trying to increase their certainty about a particular situation. Reading multiple articles about returning to school, problem solving hypothetical situations in advance, doom scrolling through Twitter and all of the social media platforms in an effort to learn as much information as possible. But although a small amount of preparation can be helpful, it actually doesn't eliminate uncertainty. There will always be a what if situation that we can think of that will serve only to make us worry more. In most aspects of life, we don't have complete certainty about anything. That's okay. We aren't completely certain when we cross the street that a car won't drive up out of nowhere and hit us, or when we leave the house that it's not going to be robbed. But when we exercise appropriate and proper safety precautions, like looking both ways when we cross the street, or making sure that we lock the door when we leave our house, we're reasonably certain that everything is going to be okay. We're not completely certain, but we know that the probability is low because of the actions that we've taken. Therefore, a healthy relationship to risk of any kind should involve developing reasonable safety precautions so that we feel that risk is low and that negative events are unlikely to happen. Not impossible, but unlikely. Instead of trying to eliminate all risk. That is impossible. So be tolerant of some uncertainty in life rather than trying to eliminate it. That's helpful. It's helpful not just in returning to school at this time in our history, but it's a good lesson and a good goal in striving for life in general. Practice tolerating uncertainty. Find ways to introduce it purposefully in your life. Make friends with being uncertain. It will help you. It'll feel uncomfortable, but it will build your tolerance for risk. It will build your adaptive coping mechanisms moving forward. And it is a proven way to reduce your anxiety overall. Specifically speaking about kids generally, we do recognize the pandemic has taken its toll on everyone, regardless of age. So even if your child is not telling you they're experiencing anxiety about returning to school, that doesn't mean that they aren't feeling uneasy about it. So sit down with them, have a conversation with them about how they're feeling. Validate their concerns and answer any questions that they have to the best of your ability. There's a big difference between telling them everything is going to be okay or saying, look, it's okay to worry. And teachers and schools are taking all of the appropriate precautions to keep you safe. One is validating. The former could be dismissive and invalidating. And pivoting towards the final few moments, again about taking care of ourselves, it is important to realize that the best way that we have of being able to care for others and to manage others' anxieties is to ensure that we're caring for ourselves as well. So find ways of practicing relaxation, meditation before bedtime, keeping consistent sleep schedules, avoiding naps if they interrupt your sleep schedule at nighttime. Limit the amount of caffeine, alcohol, and marijuana that you're consuming. Make sure that you schedule physical activity in each and every day. Pay attention to nutrition and healthy eating as much as possible. These are basic principles of self-care, but they are incredibly important as a foundation for our physical and our mental and emotional health. Couple of last points about the environment that we find ourselves in. In normal times, working and living in separate places provided some buffer between an employee's home and their work lives. The distinction between personal and professional self is common across cultures, and it has lots of benefits to it. We may carry historically some of the impact of work stress home, but we could physically leave a toxic culture or a difficult meeting, a problematic colleague at the office. Well, not so much anymore. Many of us forced to work from home now have no such hiding place. Switching a potential sanctuary from work stress to the arena that it actually plays itself out in. And many workers who cohabit, working from home in the middle of this global crisis doesn't just affect them, it impacts on their partners as well. While in normal times, couples witness their partner's work stress, few have the experience of living with it day to day so closely, week after week. It's one thing to hear about a partner's difficult boss. It's quite another thing to be able to see your loved one berated over a video conference. Living with our partner's work in such close quarters is novel for many of us, and few of us have a reliable playbook in dealing with each other's stresses. So as we acknowledge each other's stress, how do we bolster each other's emotional well-being? Well, a few steps to end with. Give the gift of regular, undivided attention. Although many couples are now together all of the time, I've actually found in my practice that many of them are still feeling lonely in their relationships. And that's because for many people, they've had to pack so much into each day, work, household chores, homeschooling, that they end up neglecting each other. Yet, having our loved ones' undivided attention, a time in which we can openly share and vent our frustrations, is one of the best release valves for stress that we know of. Couples can help each other and their relationship by giving each other 15 minutes of undivided attention at the end of each day, where they agree to simply listen openly and attentively. No suggestions, no advice. And one of the questions that you may ask is how best to support your partner. Don't make assumptions about that. The stress that we are currently experiencing is unlike the stress that we have experienced before. For many of us who may have preferred emotional supportive gestures in the past, now we might actually be valuing more practical hands the most. So with that in mind, ask your partner what they need. Don't assume that what you've been doing for them in the past is what they'd most value moving forward. Figuring out what your partner needs will help balance that in energy that you're investing to make sure that it achieves maximal relationship return. Create boundaries as much as you can between work and home. You know, the office might not be miles away any longer, but couples can still try to create some space between home and work. A good starting point may be to cordon off the physical spaces in your house where work is off limits. Take regular breaks in the daytime. Have a hard stop point in the evening before you pivot to managing your personal circumstances. And finally, although it may seem counterintuitive, find some time apart. Seeking time apart from your partner may well feel strange in a time of isolation, but it's vital to care for yourself, as we mentioned earlier. It might be a solitary walk around the block each day, the agreement to work from separate rooms, evenings occasionally spent on different activities. Whatever it is, it will help you recharge yourself and take some distance away from your partner's stress so that you're not caught up in it and potentially incapacitated by it. And as absence makes the heart grow fonder, it will do wonders for your relationship too. Just moving ahead to wrap up, we are in this together. We need to lean on our villages now more than ever. The nature of this crisis requires that we find safe and responsible ways to help each other out while upholding so many of our home and work and school responsibilities. So lean on your village, the other parents in your community, your families, your co-workers. Lean to share responsibility and look out for those who are especially needing extra help right now. Accept that things are not going to run smoothly all the time, and we aren't going to be our 100% productive time all the time. But with tempered expectations, a flexible approach, and resourcefulness, you'll be amazed at how we can all adapt to this. Taken into account, we have all adapted very well so far. The challenges aren't over yet, and there's more adaptation to come. But with any luck, we will continue to weather this crisis and emerge from it stronger and more collaborative, a modern take on an age-old approach to healthy societies. I will flag this for you, some resources that are available in our communities, digital supports available to help and boost coping mechanisms, mindfulness-based stress reduction activities, psychotherapy programs, peer support programs. A reminder, the peer support program, Big White Wall, has just rebranded itself as Together All, but it remains a tremendous source of peer support for people within the mental health community. So be kind to yourself. The strategies that we've talked about will take some time to work, and we need to practice them regularly and in different situations. Don't be hard on yourself if you forget to do something or you feel that you're not getting better right away. This does take time, and having a flexible approach where we don't expect that Thursday is going to be any better than Tuesday, but 3 Thursdays from now or 4 Thursdays from now might be better than today, can be very much more helpful in having an appropriate and appreciable sense of the timeline of change. Finally, recognize there is no such thing as failing here. It's about doing the best we can under the circumstances that we have. And it is my pleasure to be with you today to share these responses and to wrap up with about 10 minutes left. And I think we do have some time for questions and answers. We'll turn it back to Scott now, but I will make the promise that if you put your questions into the chat function and we don't have time to get to them, I'm happy to be available afterwards to respond in written format. Scott?
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Dawe. We very much appreciate that. And as Ian said, if you do have any questions, please put them into the Q&A, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. Dr. Dawe, you talked earlier about hearing those horns honking and how uplifting and motivating that was. We don't have our cars with us right now, but this is a virtual honking of our horns to say thank you to you.
Oh, thank you very much.
And all of your peers, the first responders that have helped us cope through all of this. So it's very much appreciated. A question that I have is, you talked about managing anxiety and how, sometimes we just need to be able to control it, to be able to manage it. Oftentimes, though, the anxiety that we're feeling is forced upon us. So it may be that our employers are asking us to do something that we really don't want to do, or we don't feel safe doing. So in some cases, it's very difficult to manage something that's out of your control. How do you handle things like that?
Well, I think one is about recognizing that it's not about maintaining everything within our control. The circumstances around us never are fully within our control. And as I was mentioning before, learning to accept that is the helpful first step. There's a theory in a type of psychotherapy that many of us are familiar with in the field called radical acceptance. And it comes from dialectical behavioral therapy. It talks about the notion that we must accept reality as it is in front of us. We don't want to spend our energies trying to change or somehow resist the very reality as it is. But what we want to channel our efforts in is in figuring out how to manage it. How do we deal with the consequences of the ask from the employer? What is reasonable under the circumstances that we have to manage with? And focus there. That's adaptation. It actually is about putting our energies into finding coping strategies, finding solutions, trying to, tilt against windmills, to borrow that old Don Quixote type phrase, is not helpful, because it really diverts our attention into something that we can't in fact influence. Accept the situation as it is, take a pause, self-care to calm yourselves, and then step up and figure out what needs to be done.
You talked earlier too, when you were showing statistics, that yesterday 44 of the COVID cases were in the workplace. And so on the call today, we have a lot of employers, and employers are trying to balance that, the situation they're in terms of trying to stay in business, but also trying to keep their employees safe. And at the same time as their employees are at home, trying to make sure that everyone is still productive. So there are a lot of variables, a lot of things that are happening as employers are trying to maintain a balance. And so what suggestions do you have for their own coping mechanisms?
Well, recognize, as you say, Scott, this is a very challenging time. There's a lot of stress going on and a lot of balls at play here. But we don't want to lose sight of is the public health strategies that we know will keep us safe, and figuring out how to adopt those into the business is what we need to be thinking about. Physical distancing, masks, hand hygiene, test yourselves, test your employees if symptoms are there. We must stay home in ways that we are not historically used to. 6 months ago, a year ago, many of us would come to work, or we'd send our kids to school with a sniffle. That cannot happen anymore. We need to own that responsibility to make sure that the curves that we have flattened stay flat. It is our responsibility to do that. And while it can be tricky, those clear public health parameters will be what allows us to be economically successful moving forward.
I think a lot of times through the pandemic, some people are trying to manage or hide their own anxiety so that they can help others. But I fear that that's almost like a ticking time bomb, that the people are just bottling everything else inside of them and suppressing their own feelings. And through Bell Let's Talk, we've learned that admitting that you have a problem is half the battle. But do you have other strategies for people that are just trying to be stalwart?
Well, all of those self-care circumstances are the recommendations about managing oneself. But I did want to speak to that point. It is somewhat counterintuitive for many people that sharing actually is helpful. It's helpful for you because it doesn't allow you just to bottle up the stress and the circumstances that you might be dealing with. Venting and getting some of that pressure taken off your shoulders is really helpful. But it can also be inspiring if it's done the right way. It can be helpful for your employees. It can be helpful for your colleagues. It tells people that there are conversations that can be had that aren't off limits. And it can help create that environment again that I'm telling you, I've been struggling with this myself. Here's how I've adapted to it. Here's what's going on. How have you dealt with this? And that sharing back and forth can create the conversations necessary to drive our society into the future. For our kids, it is incredibly important that we role model these types of behaviors, that we're not seen to just be the stiff upper lip people who never acknowledge what's going on, because that doesn't teach adaptive coping. Sharing what we're going through in appropriately nuanced and age-appropriate circumstances, it's actually really helpful. So don't feel that you have to be silent and strong. Those are old stereotypes of what it took to be a parent or be a man or whatever it was. That's not what's required now. So open up, embrace the opportunities, share appropriately, not too much. You don't have to reveal each and everything that's going on with you. But find courage in doing so, because it'll actually make you feel better.
One of the questions that has come in, how to recognize the physically, mentally draining side of all the work people that are now following the precautions and doing the right thing, and how to know when how much is okay and when it's too much, the impact on one person or on the workplace.
Too much means you're not functioning any longer. Carrying stress, carrying distress, we are capable as human beings to be productive even in difficult times. With that kind of 4 mantra piece I referenced earlier, if we are focused on purpose, meaning, belonging, connectedness, we will be able to carry a ton of things. But if we are not functioning, if we're not sleeping, if we are finding ourselves more and more in conflict, if our productivity has actually taken a dramatic turn downwards, those are times when we may say, okay, this is getting too much. I can't do this on my own. And you can turn within your organizations or to each other for some opportunities, for some support to help you move forward. Again, it's not about eliminating pressure or eliminating stress. We all have it, and it is present even in non-COVID situations. This is a great deal more, but so far, by doing the things that we've talked about, by spending time taking care of ourselves, we will be able to manage and get through this.
So as we're kind of re-emerging from this, what I call hibernation, you know, it's bringing people closer together than they've been in a while in shopping situations, in restaurants, and then this has created some conflict as you know, some people feel that people are getting too close to them, or some people feel that they're suddenly public health officers and they have to go around and tell people how to wear their masks properly. In some cases, it may be, you know, the wait staff at a restaurant are being told by customers that they're doing things incorrectly, and it creates a lot of stress as people are in these conflicting situations. Any strategies to deal with things like that?
Yeah, that's actually really an excellent point. And we've heard many stories coming out of our retail and service industry colleagues about being caught in the middle between people's expectations and the circumstances that they're in. And I think as a collective society, we do need to take a step back and recognize we are all trying the best we can. If somebody is truly wearing their mask incorrectly, yeah, it's appropriate to kind of take them aside and say, here's actually how that works. You know, don't actually touch the face. Only deal with the ear loops. Make sure it covers both your nose and your mouth. That's important, and that can be helpful. But by forcing the opinion, by doing it in an insulting manner or in a disrespectful manner, we are actually just playing out the stress that we feel. We're not being helpful to somebody else at that point in time. We're just reacting to our own situations there. So recognize what our motivations are going to be when we offer our opinions or our suggestions, and that will help us mitigate how we deliver those opinions so that they're not coming across in an insulting manner or in a disrespectful manner. Not helpful.
That's a good segue, because now I'm going to offer my opinion, and my opinion is this has been an amazing webinar, and as we draw it to a close, Dr. Dawe, I want to thank you on behalf of the Milton Chamber for taking time out of what is certainly probably a busy day for you to do this for us, and Lena from Bell. You know, you're an amazing partner for chambers across Canada, and especially here in Milton, and so we certainly appreciate your allowing Dr. Dawe to be part of this webinar with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott. We really appreciate what Dr. Dawe does for us with our Bell Let's Talk campaign. So thank you.
And with that, we'll draw this webinar to a close. Thank you everyone for signing in, and hopefully we'll see you all soon in a safe way. Take care.